Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on Feminist Foreign Policy. My name is Delphine O. I'm the French ambassador for gender equality, and I will be your lucky moderator for this amazing panel. Today, we're going to be talking about feminist foreign policy. I assume if you're in the room that you have at least a little bit interest in feminism and foreign policy, but you're here to learn more about feminist foreign policy and how it could be a solution for people, peace, and planet. I am joined by three amazing feminists, troublemakers, but also solution finders, which I will introduce now. And then we'll go into a series of questions to each of them for about 30 minutes. And then hopefully we'll have time for about 10 minutes of Q&A with the audience. I should have said that this session is co-organized by the Global Partner Network for Feminist Foreign Policy, aka the GPN, but I will leave Lyric introduce it. So let me introduce our speakers. Lyric Thompson, to my left, is the founder, yes, whoo, that's accurate, is the founder and CEO of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, a shared space for feminists working from within and outside of governments to advance the highest degree of ambition, innovation, inclusion, and equity in foreign policy. She is also an adjunct professor at George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs, an appointee to the U.S. Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board, and vice chair of the North Carolina Council for Women. In the middle, we're joined by Memory Kachambwa, who is the executive director, is the executive director of the African Women's Development and Communication Network, FEMNET, and a steering committee member of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative Global Partner Network. She is a Pan-African feminist, she will tell us more about this, gender and women's rights activist with over 20 years experience in developing, managing, and implementing programs for women and girls' rights, regionally and globally. And then to my left, one of my bosses, Arantxa Gonzalez. I also happen to teach at Sciences Po, for those of you who are here, because a lot of Sciences Po here at the Paris Peace Forum. Oh, wow, that much? I'm dropping my paper. Arantxa is the third dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po, and the first woman to lead it. Prior to this, she had the minor role of being Spain's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and which does not say in my bio, but she actually created Spanish feminist foreign policy, which is quite relevant to this panel. She's also worked at the United Nations as Assistant Secretary General to the United Nations in the International Trade Center, as Executive Director of the International, and served at the European Commission. In 2019, she contributed to the book Women Shaping Global Economic Governance. So today, we'll be talking about feminist foreign policy, and we'll be talking to both feminists in government and in civil society who are joining hands to disrupt traditional approaches and find more sustainable outcomes for people, peace, and planet, which is the theme. Now, more than a dozen countries around the world have joined the Feminist Foreign Policy Elite Club from all 5 UN regions. And we'll be wondering whether this could be the future for multilateralism. So my first question will be to Lyric, who is the founder of the Global Partner Network. So with the network, you've just published your third global review of the state of feminist foreign policies globally, where now 16 governments have announced such efforts. And I should be remiss if I wasn't stating that at the UN General Assembly just 2 months ago, the Global Partner Network co-organized the first ever foreign ministers meeting on feminist foreign policy. Can you tell us a little bit of an overview of the major trends and findings for what feminist foreign policy looks like today, and what potential you see in this framework for people, peace, and planet?
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador O, and thank you all for your interest in today's discussion. Thanks to the Paris Peace Forum, to the Scale Up program, which the Global Partner Network was selected in the 2022 forum as one of the top 10 solutions for peace that would receive a year of mentoring and support in our work to advance innovative and inclusive foreign policy for people, peace, and planet. So we're delighted to co-organize this panel. We've been delighted to work with and learn from your experts around the world, and to be back to tell that story today. So I think that the trend line is positive for feminist foreign policy, which is to say it has moved in less than a decade from being something that was regarded as a niche Nordic thing. Sweden was the first to announce a feminist foreign policy in 2014, which is not to say that's where the field started. That's where a foreign policy got explicitly called feminist. But of course, we all know that the antecedents for this work are in the work of feminists, international relations theorists, and feminist activists, and various evolving policy discourse, the Women, Peace, and Security Framework, et cetera. But in 2014, Sweden took the step and said, our foreign policy will be feminist now. And there was sort of a collective shrug/giggle from the rest of the governments in the world that this was, sure, something Sweden could do given their gender equality track record, but maybe not something that the rest of the world would be taking up. Fast forward 9 years, Sweden has stepped away. What are we learning from that? And the challenges of backlash and feminist pushback. But you are as likely to be a country from Latin America today as you are from Europe, as we've seen the green wave in Latin America, liberalizing abortion laws, liberalizing LGBTQ rights, and then taking that, the logical next step, to its foreign policy. So I think we in the Global Partner Network are excited about that we think that there's strength in diversity. And to the extent that the numbers continue to grow and ambition and resolve remains strong, there's potential for multilateral collaboration. There's potential for regional collaboration. Argentina just hosted the first regional convening on feminist foreign policy with a number of governments gathering in Buenos Aires at the end of August and early September. Germany and Chile co-lead a feminist foreign policy caucus at the United Nations, which was the organizing platform for the event that Ambassador O mentioned moments ago. And I think in addition to the increasing number of policies that we're seeing, we're also seeing increasing inclusivity and a more intersectional approach to feminism. So we've gone from women-y foreign policy in the early days to now a foreign policy that is truly about reconceptualizing goals around people, peace, and planet as in the national interest. So you have the Netherlands, for instance, taking as a part of their step of their feminist foreign policy a review on racism in the foreign ministry and saying we care about what's happening to people on various identity issues, and we care about marginalization and discrimination in more than just as regards gender. Colombia has the first actively pacifist feminist foreign policy, which is an interesting new model there as well. And Mexico has been really leading the way in the cohort on taking women's human rights defender language to COP and advancing the planet piece of the agenda.
Thank you very much. If we have time, I'll do a second round of questions. But now to memory. Together with a number of colleagues from the continent, you're incubating work on what an African feminist foreign policy would look like, or a manifesto would sound or entail for the continent. So can you share some of your thoughts on what it would look like?
Thank you so much, Ambassador O, and it's really great to be in this space, as always. So I'll just talk about why we feel as African feminists we need to be really engaging and centering and be active in the feminist foreign policy discourse. We have seen that most of the continent is not taking on in terms of what we have seen in Global North and also what we're seeing in Latin America. And we came together and we're saying we need to actually have what we're calling African feminist informed policies to make it broad, because feminist policies because we are looking at international relations and considering the diversities of each of the African countries. So there is interest, and one of the things is we want to reclaim, particularly having a feminist activist within policy making, particularly policy making that is related to international relations, to foreign policy. And we also thinking of creating a space of rethinking, reimagining, and leveraging on some of the existing tools of feminist policies on the continent. We've got the African Charter on Feminist Principle. We've got the Maputo Protocol, which is the African Protocol on Women's Rights. We also have been implementing within the women, peace, and security sector a multitude of policies and practices, and we're saying how do we bring that together, but also informing global feminist foreign policies. So we have countries, Lyric mentioned the 16 countries that we have seen advancing feminist foreign policy. So it's to also offer a critique in terms of what is really missing within the framing of that, and also saying as African feminists, can we also use our agency, use our autonomy to also make certain demands on what for feminist foreign policy should also entail. So looking at some of the issues which we know, perpetuate inequalities, perpetuate and bring in a decolonial feminist lens, and also start challenging migration policies, challenging the whole issue around militarization, challenging the neo-colonial, we really see some of those critical issues as being important, but also offering alternatives to say what would really, if we had feminist foreign policies abroad as well as domestic, if countries with feminist foreign policies that work and on the continent, what's the alternative feminist vision that would like to see, and a lot of it would be really around dismantling this masculine patriarchal norm, that hegemony that we see. And it will be also, secondly, in terms of creating knowledge and owning on knowledge and investing in knowledge and research, which is coming out of the African continent. And of course, supporting and strengthening the women's movements that are thinking and advancing feminist policies, and really working together in terms of global north, global south, and also creating more networks, south-to-south collaborations, but really rooting it in a very decolonial, geopolitical lens, which is really about dismantling all what we see right now. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So there's kind of the internal focused work towards the African governments, and then the external focused work towards the existing 16 feminist foreign policy governments. Now, turning to Arantxa, I actually have two questions in one. I know I'm not allowed, but I'll still do it. So the first one is one of the continents that is really blooming when it comes to feminist foreign policy is South America. So 1/4 of the 16 governments, 4 of these governments are actually from South America. So Mexico, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. So we keep wondering if there's a South American brand of feminist foreign policy. How come, unlike the African continent or Asia and Middle East, there's been a surge in feminist foreign policy in recent years? So even though you're not from South America, but the only Spanish speaker on this panel, I was wondering if you could share thoughts on that. And the other one is, you were a minister before, you initiated a feminist foreign policy. Now that it's been almost 10 years since the first country, Sweden, adopted a feminist foreign policy, as an observer of international news, what do you see as major successes and major pitfalls of FFP?
Wow. So let me first on the whether there is some sort of Latin American brand of feminist foreign policy. What I would say is that there is a commitment in Latin America to equality. And there is in the room someone that can speak much better than I can, Maria Fernanda, that is hiding in the back, that could talk a lot about that. But what I think, I mean, look, when I started the feminist foreign policy in Spain, we talked a lot to others. Mexico had done it before Spain. So we talked a lot, and France had done it before Spain. So we talked a lot with those that had done it in order to get inspiration. By the same token, others that had not done it talked to us once we had done it. So what there has been is a lot of sharing the experience, but every country chooses a special focus and a special angle. And the angle is not the same in every country. This is why I don't think there is a brand. I think what there is this is a reflection of a commitment to address a problem that we all feel in our societies needs to be dismantled, which is the question of inequalities. Now, if I look at what these 10 years have told us in this trying to dismantle this big inequality that is, as Memory was saying, ingrained in our societies, ingrained in our culture, ingrained in our economies. The first thing I would say is that what has worked is that by doing feminist foreign policy, we acknowledge that there is a multidimensional aspect to inequalities, and that we have to use all tools that we have at our disposal to address inequalities. And that there is no stone that we should left unturned. Because the more we turn the stones, the more we realized that there are hidden discriminations that are not very obvious to our eyes, but that exist. This is what happened when we started looking to international trade and discover that only 1 out of 5 exporters was a woman-owned business. And that this was not a coincidence. Is that there were specific obstacles. So, you know, the good thing about feminist foreign policy is that it has showed us that we've got to leave no stone unturned. And then when we turn the stones, we actually find the discriminations that are very deeply rooted in the power relations that have been prevalent for so many centuries. The bad part, because there is also a bad part. We should not just take this as a brand. This is not just a branding tool. It's not a branding exercise. It's not because you have a feminist foreign policy that you finish the job. Actually, it starts there. And I fear that this is what happens in many countries that adopt foreign policy, feminist foreign policy, is that in the end, there is no follow-up, that there is no looking at, you know, what have we, how much have we moved the needle? You know, how many barriers have we dismantled? What have we done? Where are the indicators? So this second part is the one we have to fight against because this is not a branding exercise. This is a profound response to a profound problem we have in our societies, which is very deep-rooted inequalities.
Thank you very much, Arantxa. So kind of building on that, back to Lyric. So you mentioned the fact that this group is growing, expanding. There's even more diversity in the group, geographic diversity. There's potential for multilateral and regional collaboration. You also mentioned, however, that the pioneer of this group, Sweden, withdrew, very unfortunately, last year from the group. And reflecting on those almost 10 years of feminist foreign policy, we should, of course, rejoice in this group expanding, but there's also cause for concern that some of the historical founders of this group may be subject to the change of political winds, which is the game of democracy. And how do we ensure that feminist foreign policy stays on when there's change of governments? So this panel is entitled Feminist Foreign Policy as a Solution for People, Peace and Planet, but is it also a solution for democracy?
I think that might be beyond my particular expertise. But I do think that we have to acknowledge and learn from a political problem that feminist foreign policy has, which is that the antis hate it more than the allies like it. And so while the wave of progressive governments who have come to power and are, taking a lens to their foreign policy and saying, we want to be highest ambition, we want to be inclusive, we want to be about equity, thank you, are just as likely to step away from that as backlash grows and as very well-funded anti-feminist movements, which I should note, much of the funding for these movements comes from the EU, comes from the US, comes from places that like to think that they're, a force for good and justice and equality in the world. So I think it's incumbent upon those countries to take a look at what they can do to crack down on the roots of power within their borders. And the financial flows and things, as well as to think about all of the really exciting and innovative stuff that they can do both, bilaterally through their own foreign policies and multilaterally in cooperation with each other. I have a slightly, I think, potentially controversial take on Sweden stepping away from its feminist foreign policy, which is that I, of course, mourn the loss of someone who did forge the path forward. But I think that if you have a situation, if we are defining feminist foreign policy as highest level of ambition, and then you have a government that comes to power and says, we want to cut our aid budgets, we do not care about multilateralism, then you don't want to continue to call that feminist. That is the definition of pinkwashing. So I think it's incumbent on us, as the club grows, to keep their seat warm, but to continue to embrace those highest level standards for ambition and say that if you want to be part of this club, it's the contents and not the container that matters, in the words of Noeline Noblivu of a fantastic organization called Diva for Equality in Fiji. And I think that's been the goal of the Global Partner Network, is to say, you don't have to call your feminist, your foreign policy feminist. That word may close more doors than it opens for you in your particular context. But if you're going to call your foreign policy feminist, then here is a series of global standards that foreign policy needs to work towards in order to be deserving of a moniker that is not, again, just about more women, but is about taking a power-based analysis to how the levers of foreign policy have traditionally been used to marginalize, to oppress, and how can you reconceptualize those goals around people, peace, and planet.
Thank you. Memory, you've mentioned your work as an advocate with the Pan-African Network to advocate for governments to use the existing tools. You mentioned the African Charter and Feminist Principles, the Maputo Protocol, and all the WPS policies to ingrain feminism in their national and international policies. So how is it working? How are you working with some of the national governments on the continent? I'm thinking, for instance, about Liberia, which had announced, I think, was it 2 years ago, a feminist foreign policy, and we were together in Kigali very recently, and we talked to the Minister of Gender of Liberia, and she said they're actively working on that. So how do you work with governments on the continent for them to use existing tools, but also to actually have the highest level of ambition and standards that Lyric was mentioning?
So what we have really seen on the continent is, I think, picking from what Lyric mentioned, that the anti-gender movement, the anti-rights movement has even permeated into the human rights architecture. They are part of government. They are part of the UN itself. They're part of institutions which should be upholding women's rights. So we found it very difficult to be able to progress, because we have some gatekeepers. But having said that, there's still a lot of opportunity. So Liberia, for example, one of the things we found is we still have within the different governments at national level feminist technocrats, so to speak, who are really willing to be able to push the bar, because we've seen the ripple effect of the you know, when our ideals on gender are actually attacked, it goes on, it attacks the democratic space, the human rights space. So we are seeing a few growing advocates within. We've also seen a lot of what works is having the government speak to themselves, because when civil society comes in, you know, they'll be like, oh yeah, feminists, that's a foreign agenda. So we are saying, this is really not a foreign agenda, but it's an opportunity for us to start infusing some of the principles, the African feminists, the Pan-African ideals, you know, using principles like Ubuntu, really pushing for alternative ways and saying the alternative way to peace, to democracy, to protecting the planet is really rooted in a feminist agenda. So we see advocates in some of those intersecting ways. And I think there's also a growing interest and realization of the impact of the neo-colonial agenda. And so you find once governments get it, then they're also willing to talk to us, to advance. And we always say it should be the feminist, you know, feminist space is always much contested, like questioning, you know, making propositions. We have them. We are pushing for K-economy. We are pushing for well-being. We are pushing for very practical wins. And even in countries where we see there are a lot of women who are in politics, we are also challenging and saying, you must remove reservations you have on family law, on abortion, you know. So it's to also challenge and say we cannot be just having numbers without some critical transformation. And Rwanda recently did it. I mean, just last year they removed some of the reservations they had. So on abortion laws, we've seen countries like Ethiopia, you know, they've had really progressive laws even at the national level. We recently also did a study on some 5 countries in the Francophone region, looking at the extent to which they were incorporating comprehensive sexuality education. The policies are there. So it's working and trying to push and say, even from civil society, can you move into government? Because we saw it. I think it's been such a privilege being part of the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative, where you see how individuals who are part of writing feminist foreign policies can come together, share their experiences, ask around. So we are also trying to work and see if we can get more people inside, because it's the people inside who are going to really shape and really write those policies, yeah. But it's a learning curve.
Thank you so much for providing also the specific examples of how you're moving the needle on women's rights. Arantxa, I have a tough question. In my view, one of the areas where we're still very much struggling to implement a feminist foreign policy is the women, peace and security agenda, where we are, you know, compared to the progress we've made on gender-based violence, on sexual and reproductive health and rights, on women's economic empowerment, you know, nothing's perfect, but I feel like in the women, peace and security agenda, where we have a UN resolution, we've had it for 23 years, really the progress is, I want to be politically correct, but fragile, if any way visible. And this is obviously a very timely question, considering different crises. I don't want to put you on the spot on specific crises and conflicts, but and you're involved in, you know, circles of women global leaders that are actively trying to mobilize around peace. How do you see that?
So let me pay tribute to one of these circles, which is Global Women Leaders, which is a network of former UN heads of organization that are from our new positions continue to be engaged in pushing these borders. Let me make a parenthesis before answering your question, because I liked a lot what Lyric and what Memory have said. One of the problems we have is that we've been boxed into this idea that asking for equality is some sort of culture war, or that it's some sort of, we have turned into some sort of walk, you know, the wokeism, this famous wokeism that I read about. So let's not get ourselves boxed, and let's reclaim equality as an essentially democratic imperative in our societies. Close parenthesis. On women, peace and security, there are many angles to this. Let me point at two. One where we are making a bit of progress. The other one where we still got a way to go. Where are we making progress? Women, peace and security is also about making sure peacekeeping missions, military operations, the military on the ground are more diverse and are more gender sensitive. And these are things that each government that commits to a feminist foreign policy can do. Training your military to respect women in conflict or when they are deployed on the ground as relatively low-hanging fruit. You don't have to ask for permission to anyone. You can just do it at home. Make this part of your feminist foreign policy. The other part where we have much more difficulty is on bringing women to the tables where the settlements of conflicts are being discussed. And this is really, you know, again, it's not that we want to turn this into some sort of culture war. It's that we know that you have, if you bring the voices of all the stakeholders involved in a conflict, and women are also involved in a conflict. Very often they are the victims of a conflict. If you bring them to the table, if they can bring their perspective, if their views are incorporated, the likelihood that the settlement would be more solid, would last longer, is higher. So again, Delphine, just to give you a sense of, also let's, you know, to give a sense that there are things that are happening and that can be done without, you know, big international treaties and without asking for big permission.
Thank you. Before we go into the room, just wanted to give you an opportunity to each of you maybe to respond to something that has been said, to when your co-panelists rebound.
I think your last question, Delphine, is the one that is the biggest challenge for the movement at the moment. I think if you look at Israel-Palestine, if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Iran, you know, I think the question around peace and how much does it take to be able to assemble political will to keep people safe, to allow for human and planetary flourishing, and an acknowledgement that as it currently stands, our multilateral system is failing to do that. Can these countries do better? 16 is not close to the numbers that we need, and we all know those 16 are not perfect. But is there a path forward where you move from rhetoric to reality? And I think that this, you know, gathering at this particular moment under the banner of peace is a real, we're in a crisis, and we need to be able to have difficult conversations with each other about why things aren't working, what we need to do differently, and if we're courageous enough to try.
Thank you. Memory?
Yeah, I think just also peeking from Lyric, I think one of the things that is concerning learning from Sweden is, can countries which decide to have a feminist foreign policy or feminist development policy have it ingrained in a way in a way that it shouldn't be about the government of the day, because a foreign policy is not about a government of the day. You know, when a country decides to have its foreign policy, its positioning in terms of its global geopolitics, it is about that. So how do we make sure feminist foreign policy really sticks? It lasts, it's sustained. There is actually support in that commitment, and there is also a space which allows for its critique, because I think just having statements, it's not enough. And although it's provoking, because at least we bring a nuance and a solution, but I feel feminist foreign policy should not be seen as soft issue, but it is a hard issue. It is core. The crisis that we are globally facing, the climate crisis from our continent, the debt crisis, all these triple interlocking crises are crises we know the feminist movement globally has been at the call of fighting. I mean, our feminist principles, feminist thinking is really around dismantling all these oppressions which we see playing out. And so for me, it's how do you really get that sustained there? We get more people into the club, but even having more advocates, who are there safeguarding it so that we don't lose it. And it's on the table, when discussions are being made. Yeah.
We're at 9 minutes left. If anybody wants to ask a question, yes, wow. Thank you, Sciences Po. I think mics may be circulated. Yes, here. So probably the closest person to you. Thank you.
If I can, I don't know if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. There are two mics. Go ahead, you in the back, and then you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jamila Venturini. I lead an organization working on digital rights in Latin America, which is working on technology, human rights, and social justice. And my question to you is regarding how discussions around digital technologies that have been so present here and within different multilateral spaces and that have a lot of impact on equality, but have not necessarily had equality as a key principles, are being part of the conversations you're having, and what role do you think the feminist foreign policy could play in that field? Thank you.
I'll just jump in and say that we just, as Ambassador O mentioned, did our third global review of feminist foreign policies, and Germany is one of the newest members of the cohort and have explicitly focused on digital as part of their feminist foreign policy, and I believe they were the only country, correct me if I'm wrong, who had elevated it at that level. So definitely commend that as an approach to, and would be very interested in your feedback on it. But I certainly think it's an area where we urgently need greater attention, scholarship, and growth. So thanks for your work.
Algorithms, data. All of this is, again, leave no stone unturned, which is why feminist foreign policy has to have as an ingredient that you look at the different policies you're going to be negotiating, discussing, debated with a gender lens. If you look at digital, there is a big issue. We are reproducing in the digital space the biases we have in the world that we know, in the physical world. So we have to be very careful, because we now know that with artificial intelligence we can augment. We can also augment the inequalities. So yeah, leave no stone unturned.
I'll briefly step out of my role as a moderator because I have an important piece of information. France is actually launching, as part of its feminist foreign policy, a laboratory for women's rights online. It's a very recent announcement that we made at the UN General Assembly and that I remade yesterday. It will be a multi-stakeholder platform convening both governments, international organizations, civil society organizations, and the tech industry to work on incubating technological solution to prevent, identify, and eradicate online gender-based violence. We'll be working on the whole spectrum of online gender-based violence and harassment, on non-consensual imagery and image-based abuse. We'll be working on algorithmic bias, moderation, the use of artificial intelligence for this purpose. We'll be also doing research on men's movements and incel masculinist movements. So that will be launched next year, but we're currently working to bring on especially some of the major tech platforms to be working with us and CSOs and governments. Sorry for that. Going back to questions. Yes, you.
Students at Sciences Po, and I specialize in Latin American affairs. This morning I presented my research on the institutionalization of the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina at the Sorbonne Université, and sort of thinking about that and the interconnection between local feminist policies. What do you think is the connection between local feminist policy and feminist foreign policy? Do you think to categorize the country as having a feminist foreign policy, should there be greater attention given to their local policies? Specifically, I'm thinking about the case of Mexico. Between 2015 and 2021, we've seen a 135% increase in the number of femicides. That does not consider despartidos or number of sexual violences. So to have a feminist foreign policy, should we have a better look at the local policies? Thank you.
Who wants to go on this? Memory?
Yeah, so I think it's important for having both. So it's important for domestic policies to be also well aligned to feminist foreign policy, because it doesn't make, I mean, it's important you can't talk of foreign policy when your domestic policy is not feminist. And I think in the review Lyric mentioned, there's also an analysis of how countries with feminist foreign policies have also made a lot of improvement in also their domestic policies, and also the gaps that are still existing. Yeah.
Just to add two sentences on that, I think this principle of policy coherence is one of the most important ones to get right. And it's also one of the hardest, because we all know that gender equality hasn't been achieved anywhere. And every country has work that they need to do. I think I am heartened by many of the Latin American examples, because the trajectory has been vibrant feminist movement at home, partners with progressive government to push for liberalization of restrictive laws and the elimination of discrimination. And then, as a next step, you look to your foreign policy of, okay, if we have liberalized our abortion law, what are we doing to support abortion rights regionally and globally? If we have, opened opportunities for LGBTQ people in our domestic law, how are we partnering with other countries to do that on the international stage? So I think that's the narrative arc that you like to see, is that this is a partnership between feminist movements and a responsiveness to that by government that starts at home and then goes global. That's not always what happens, though. And I think Mexico is a really interesting example for exactly the reasons you mentioned. And also for the fact that in taking forward, they were the first country in Latin America, the first country in the South to adopt a feminist foreign policy. They explicitly included a priority focus on gender-based violence in the region and abroad. And what is the story that we can tell as we watch what happens when a toehold may start in foreign policy, where maybe there's less eyes watching, maybe you can get away with more innovation and exciting kind of ideas. Mexico was also, as part of its feminist foreign policy, performing gay marriages in its embassies before that was federally a right at home. So incoherence, yes, but is it a place where you can put a stake in the sand and say this is an issue that the government is now on the record of caring about, And then is there a spillover effect in domestic policy? It may be that the answer is no. And then I think the credibility issues that you raise are really important ones. But I'm open to this being an experiment and seeing how domestic and foreign policies talk to each other and influence each other. And my hope is it's for the better, no matter who goes first.
So we have time for one final question. Yes, ma'am, here. You. No. Yeah, you. If you have a mic somewhere, yeah. And
Hi,
then we'll
my
wrap
name
up.
is Stella. I'm from Kenya, and I'm part of the collaborative, the research collaborative. This is just a general question that I keep asking myself because we're just coming from Hague with the team, Lyric, and one of the things that we kept asking ourselves is appropriation, you know. Part of appropriation is, the other flip side is accountability. So how do we measure accountability as part of the response around feminist foreign policy? And the other thing that that just keeps getting into my mind is the issue around, and it sits in the incoherence of policy, is a lot of the times when governments, if you look at the government's talk around feminist foreign policy, it's really around reproductive rights. Right? It's abortion, it's gender-based violence. When we look at other issues around trade and development, when you look at issues that are around climate justice, militarization, the inequalities that are replicated are the same inequalities that have historically been replicated within the reproductive justice movement. And so how do we see that in the future and proactively take leadership around that to start nuancing some of those things that some of the lessons and our lived experiences that you've learned so far? It's just, I don't know, anyone.
Ancha, do you want to? Since you talked about trade.
Yeah. No, on appropriation, I would say that the feminist foreign policy, like any policy at home that you want to last, you've got to debate. You've got to discuss. I had to go to Parliament. I mean, the way I did it in Spain, I ran lots of consultations with every stakeholder, including with the Parliament, with all the political forces. Some, let's say, were a bit more skeptical. They thought that a feminist foreign policy was that I would paint the ministry building in pink. But you know, okay, we could have this conversation. We had this conversation. We debunked a bit these myths. We put on the table things like, why is it that we accept to have different pay for work of equal value? Why? Someone tell me what's ideological about that? So this process of debating it is what helps with appropriation. Rather than just simply top down, this government has decided that. Because then what happens, as you rightly said, the government changes, the policy is gone. So appropriation is very important. And then on the, my advice would be to try and make it encompassing. I mean, of course, you run the risk of getting multiple constituencies against multiple issues. You can get the constituency that hates abortion, and then the constituency that hates that more women are in the military, and then the constituency that... So you can run the risk of multiplying the fronts of those that would not like it, but you will give a fairer representation of where the challenges are, because the challenges are across the board.
We're over time. Any burning concluding thoughts? Memory?
I think for me to say, this is my first time attending the Peace Forum, but to say feminist foreign policy should be in the main agenda. Not late, but it should really be on top of the agenda. Yeah, that's all.
Okay, so see you next year at the Peace Forum. It will be in the main stage.
In the plenary.
Thank you very much.